Hello folks and welcome. My name is John Drake. I'm an assistant professor in the Sustainable Resources Management Department here at ESF, and I am here today to introduce you to the forest ecosystem science as a discipline and as a specific major of study here at ESF. And so I am going to give you an introduction to the field of forest ecosystem science, and then I'll introduce you to me. I'll kind of describe who I am, how I came to be in my scientific career, and why I study one particular aspect of forest ecosystem science. And then I'll give you an example of a project that we've been doing in this field to try to understand forest responses to aspects of climate change, and particularly the ability of forests to continue to store carbon in the future, as an example of one of the big research projects that can be done when a number of people collaborate in this field. Okay, so let's start with defining this term. So an ecosystem is all of the biological organisms within a system in a given place at a given time, and the interactions that they have with each other and the interactions that they have with their chemical and physical environment. So this picture to the right-hand side of the slide shows a number of organisms. So there's many different kinds of plants in this picture. There are a number of animals, birds, and other organisms, right, that are part of this system, even if they didn't make it into the photo. Aspects of the physical environment are important here as well. So this soil pit shows differences in the structure of that soil. That soil has different compositional aspects of sand, silt, and clay, organic matter, and the availability of nutrients affects the function of this whole system. And of course, we have an enormous diversity of microbes that live in this soil, fungi and nematodes and bacteria. And so all of this is fair game for our conceptual understanding of forest ecosystem science. So forest ecosystem science is a systematic study of the structure and function of forest ecosystems, with an emphasis on kind of a foundational and fundamental understanding of how these systems are structured and how they function. So this field often, there's an emphasis on kind of sort of what I'm calling how and why questions. And so this field of forest ecosystem science has less emphasis on aspects of applied management relative to the fields of natural resources management or forest resources management, two other majors within this department, where the emphasis is more towards the applied management of these systems. But I don't think you should completely separate this idea of a scientific understanding and management as well. By understanding how a forest system works and really understanding it very well, some of that knowledge will be translational into management. And so many people who study forest ecosystem science, there is an application to management, even if it is not emphasized all the time. So here are some examples of how and why questions that are examples that came to my mind when thinking about this field. So why do boreal forests have small trees but really thick organic soils, while tropical forests have really tall and large trees but thin soils with not much organic matter? That's a big difference. Why does that come about? We might ask questions about systems. Are ecosystems resilient to change, or are they near some tipping point? Would some disturbance fundamentally change the nature of an ecosystem? You might ask a question that relates to the communities of these systems. So grasses and woody plants often coexist in systems for long time periods. Why doesn't one group competitively exclude the other? And apologize, this is cut off at the bottom, but how much carbon do forests store, and will this continue into the future? An applied question that I will emphasize later in this talk. Here are some examples of the kinds of scales that people might be thinking about in this field. So much of my work has to do in the top section there, where we have the structure of a pine needle and the the structure of a forest canopy. So what is the function of these underlying tissues? How do they contribute to forest growth? We might study aspects of the form and function of trees. Other people in forest ecosystem science might be asking questions about community composition. How do these different species interact with each other? Other people in forest ecosystem science might be asking questions that are more about whole ecosystems. In the bottom left here, we have a photo of observations of weather and also the deposition of acidity into northeastern systems. So what is the impact of acid rain on the structure and function of northern forests? And on the bottom right, we have a heat map showing temperature, and the climate is changing, and how will that impact the structure and function of forests? So the forest ecosystem science degree is a degree program that is accredited by the Society of American Foresters. It is a forestry degree and opens doors for students with this degree, and they are allowed to apply to many job opportunities that require an accredited degree program. I got a biology degree, not a forestry degree, so there are job opportunities, for example, in the U.S. Forest Service or the Department of Environmental Conservation that a graduate of this degree program would be allowed to apply for, and someone like me would not be allowed to apply to that program. So like many of the degrees in this program, or in this department, there are foundational courses, English, biology, chemistry, economics, calculus, that are kind of required for a core understanding and are frequently taken in the first couple of years. In this degree program, there's more of an emphasis on the on fundamental science courses. And so students in this degree program are asked to take 2 semesters of the harder general biology course that's intended for biology majors, 2 semesters of the harder general chemistry course that's intended for chemistry majors, a physics class, a calculus class. So we're kind of turning up the heat on the fundamental science. FRM and NRM students take a similar group of courses for a foundational scientific understanding of their field, but those degree programs would take less of those fundamental science courses and perhaps classes that are a bit less rigorous than this FES degree. And later on in the FES degree program, notice the bottom of the professional courses where there are 9 credits of biology-directed electives, ecosystem and ecology-directed electives, and management and human dimensions-directed electives. So students in their FES degree program have substantial choice in what courses they take in the latter part of their time here at ESF, which allows them to specialize in particular areas that they are interested in. There is still some management embedded in this degree program, but it is de-emphasized relative to FRM, for example, and the basic science is cranked up and emphasized. Many, but not all, FES graduates are pursuing a career in science and go on to scientific endeavors, some of which going into graduate degree programs. There's a number of faculty that contribute to forest ecosystem science. Here are some examples of them. There are many other faculty in the department that also contribute, but these are some of the names and faces of folks that you will have in different courses and in your interactions with faculty. So I teach 2 classes that are relevant to this degree program. I teach Natural Resources Ecology, which is a 200 level class. It's meant to be in kind of an introduction to ecological ideas. And I teach FOR132, which is the structure and function of trees, which teaches kind of the fundamental biology of how trees work as organisms. So here's an example from a researcher in the department, Dr. Ruth Yanai. And Ruth has a long-standing interest in nutrient cycling in soils and how nutrient cycling affects the function of forests. So temperate forests, like this northern hardwood stand in New Hampshire, are generally thought to be limited by the availability of soil nitrogen. Nitrogen takes a long time to accumulate in ecosystems, and temperate regions tend to be geologically young because glaciers have scoured the soil away from these systems and then retreated, such that the soil and the ecosystems that have developed in temperate regions tends to be relatively young in compared to, for example, tropical systems, which are very old and highly weathered soils. So we think temperate systems would be nitrogen limited, but human activities have dumped a whole lot of nitrogen on these systems over time as we have emitted nitrogen to the atmosphere, and that nitrogen has been deposited on these ecosystems as a component of acid rain in particular. So are these systems still nitrogen limited, or have we alleviated that end limitation via human emissions and deposition of nitrogen? Ruth set out to find out, and she took an experimental approach, and she identified 3 stages of forest development: young, mid-aged, and mature forest stands in New Hampshire. And those stands have different compositions of species. You can see these young stands have a relatively large amount of pin cherry and white birch, early successional species. And the mature stands have a larger component of sugar maple and yellow birch, which are slower growing, shade tolerant, later successional species. And they implemented a forced fertilization experiment where in some of these stands, so in replicated stands within each of these forest age categories, they applied nitrogen fertilizer in some plots, phosphorus fertilizer to other plots, and nitrogen and phosphorus to yet additional plots, and compared them to unfertilized control plots. So this is an example of what you might do in forest ecosystem science. You start with a question about the fundamental workings of a forest system. You then test that question with, in this example, an experimental approach. And this is what they found. So this figure shows the growth rate of trees within these 3 age categories as measured by the basal area increment. So trees are approximately a circle, and how much larger that circle gets each year is called the basal area increment. If you relativize that compared to a given condition, we now have their units of relative basal area increment. And the effects of nitrogen and phosphorus are shown here in these box plots. And so recall that our expectation was that when we fertilized these systems with nitrogen, their tree growth would increase substantially. We expected the blue bars to be considerably higher than the white bars. That would be reflective of nitrogen limitation of these systems. And we see a little of that maybe in the youngest forest. We see a modest but still significant increase in the growth of trees that were given additional phosphorus, particularly in those middle-aged and mature systems. So perhaps these systems are more strongly limited by phosphorus than we had expected. But I would kind of emphasize that neither of these nutrient amendments very strongly increase the rate at which these trees are growing. And perhaps their growth is more limited by the availability of other resources in their environment. Perhaps another nutrient in the soil like potassium or calcium, or perhaps their growth is limited by temperature or light. So with that introduction to the field and that example of research from Ruth's work, I'll give you an introduction to who I am. So I think of myself as primarily someone who is interested in the physiology of trees and how the physiology of trees scales up to influence aspects of forest ecosystems that we care about. I care about the production of forest systems, the rate of woody accumulation, and how that contributes to how much carbon can be stored in forests. I got my bachelor's degree in biology from a small little school called Hope College in Western Michigan. It's not too dissimilar to ESF in a way that it is a small school where students have substantial interactions with faculty. After my undergraduate degree, I went and did a PhD with a particular researcher I was very keen to work with at the University of Illinois, and then did a series, worked as a researcher in what's called a postdoctoral research associate at Boston University, where I studied soils, and I spent 5 years near Sydney, Australia, where I was studying the physiology of eucalypt trees before I came and took a position here at SUNY ESF. And I've made a faux pas here and used the department name of the previous department name, which was Forests and Natural Resources Management. And the department name now has been renamed to more fully embrace the students in the department in the construction management and sustainable energy management programs. And we are now called Sustainable Resources Management, SRM. So I became interested in this field, went on this journey to become a researcher and a professor, I think in ways that might be similar to some of you here at ESF. So I was one of those kids that was always fascinated with the outdoors. I was really into camping and scouts as a child. I had this affinity for forests and kind of enjoyed being in forests. In college, I had the ability and the kind of opportunity to work directly with professors on research projects of a couple of different sorts that helped me kind of find my way as to what kind of science I was interested in. And after college, I had this kind of amazing realization moment that graduate school is an opportunity to get paid to get an advanced degree studying something I was already kind of naturally really excited about, something I might study anyway for free, somebody would pay me to do. And so I absolutely loved my experience in graduate school. And since then, I've cultivated a career in research through postdoctoral research positions, and now is my position here as a professor, where I both continue to do meaningful research in science in my field, while also get to contribute to teaching and mentoring students and graduate students. So one of my messages for you today is to take opportunities that come up to work with faculty or in research endeavors outside of the classroom. For some of you, that might be participating in research projects as an undergraduate assistant in labs. For others of you, that might be taking an opportunity to do an internship. I think these sorts of initiatives outside of the classroom are really important for students to kind of find their way, understand what they're actually interested in, and get their shoe in the door at employers or in career paths. So as a very young undergraduate student, as a freshman, I kind of didn't know what I was doing. I knew I was kind of interested in biology, and I just volunteered to work in a biology lab. And what it turned out, what they were doing in that lab is trying to understand the evolutionary relationship between different plants in this particular family of plants called bromeliads, which are kind of have a circular growth form and grow as epiphytes on other plants, particularly in these tropical forests. So I would grind up bromeliad plant leaves, I would extract the DNA, and then we would sequence that DNA, and based on the sequences, understand the evolutionary history of those organisms. So that was kind of interesting, but it was a lot of lab work. It was a whole lot of pipetting and wearing a lab coat, and I didn't find it kind of emotionally fulfilling in the way that I was hoping to. Later in my undergraduate career, I did another research project with a ecologist. I had kind of discovered ecology as a driver of my interests. And so this is Dr. Greg Murray, and he has a long-standing research project about these gap pioneer plants in the cloud forests of Costa Rica, and I spent a summer studying Costa Rican cloud forests with Dr. Murray. And really cemented in my mind this idea that I love being outside and doing work in forests. And I pursued a line of work to try to be able to do work outside, but still be doing research in biology. And I think these two research experiences were really foundational to me getting established and knowing what I wanted to do and having the tools and the relationships to help me pursue those things. Okay, so this is kind of an example of what I think about. So my wife and I did a driving trip through the American West. We visited national parks and saw all sorts of amazing things. This is the north rim of the Grand Canyon, and my wife made fun of me because most people would take photos of the Grand Canyon, of this beautiful vista, and I was taking photos of these trees of unusual shape and form right on the canyon ridge. So this conifer tree was probably struck by lightning and led to this unusually forked form. It exists on almost no soil whatsoever on this rocky outcrop. Its roots probably go down down deep in between the rocks. And so what's this tree doing? Is it doing a lot of photosynthesis? Is it growing very fast? Is it water limited? So I think a lot about the operation of trees in their natural environment. A lot of what I do when we try to understand these environmental drivers of what trees are doing, it is often useful to do an experimental approach and to change those experimental drivers and compare them to control conditions. So we can have an experimental treatment that manipulates the environment that trees are experiencing and compare the physiology or the growth rate or the form of trees in that treated category relative to trees in an untreated control category. So here are three ways that we can manipulate the environment of a tree. On the left here, you see a large structure that is a rainout shelter. That shelter senses rain and closes up the roof and doors to exclude rain from falling onto these trees that are growing in large pots outside, which allows us to do a manipulation of water availability and understand plants' response to drought. In the right, we have a warming treatment where infrared lamps are pointed at plants and used to warm the surface of these seedlings, and we can compare their growth rate and physiological function compared to control groups. We can also control the atmospheric environment of trees, in this case using an exclosure down at the bottom, and we can manipulate the concentration of the composition of that atmosphere to mimic changes that are occurring. In this case, we are controlling the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere around plants. So I'd like to spend some time talking about carbon dioxide and elements of global climate change as an example of the work that I've contributed to in the field of forest ecosystem science. So carbon dioxide is a component of our atmosphere. The concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere have not been stable in time. They have cycled through the past many thousands of years. Here we're showing concentrations of CO2 that are measured in the ice of Antarctica. So a team of researchers took a large ice core down through the glacier. That ice is laid down in annual cycles, almost like a tree ring. And then but in between the ice crystals, there's these little pockets of air that are like a little time capsule of what the atmosphere was like 300,000 or 400,000 years ago. And we can measure the concentration of gases in that ice core. And there were glacier and interglacier cycles, and this concentration of CO2 cycled with it. But recently there has been a dramatic increase in the concentration of CO2 that is unrelated to glacier and interglacial cycles that comes from human activity, right? So we are burning fossil fuels, coal and oil, and we are emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. And that is changing the planet in ways that are affecting trees and forests. That CO2 has been associated with a dramatic increase in the temperature of the planet. This figure comes from a climate change special report that came from this current administration of our federal government. This is from the most recent assessment in the year 2017, in which there's a dramatic increase in the surface temperature, particularly of the northern hemisphere, and in which case the vast majority of the warmest year on record have been very recent. And very recently, NASA put out this figure just a couple of days ago showing the temperature of the summer months, so June, July, and August. And the summer of 2020 was the hottest on record in the Northern Hemisphere and contributes to this remarkable upward trend in the temperature of our planet. This is directly related to CO2 emissions that humans have put CO2 into the atmosphere. This might be a little bit of a complicated figure for you, but it shows the energy balance of the Earth. So the units here reflect the energy transfers from radiation in watts per meter squared. So we have incoming solar energy at the top of the atmosphere of 340 watts per meter squared. Some of that's reflected back to space by things like clouds, and most of it is absorbed by the surface of the planet and ends up warming up the surface of the planet. And our planet then radiates heat energy back into space, the so-called thermal outgoing. But some of that thermal energy that's radiated out from this planet is intercepted by gases in the atmosphere, where it can be reflected back down to the surface in the so-called greenhouse effect. Now, it's actually quite a good thing that we have a greenhouse effect, or life on this planet would be a heck of a lot colder than it would be otherwise, and it'd be very challenging for organisms with our kind of physiology. But the rising CO2 concentration in the atmosphere exacerbates this greenhouse effect and traps more heat. And this is how and why the temperature of the planet is changing. Perhaps you would be surprised to know that most of the CO2 emissions that we put into the atmosphere doesn't actually stay there. There is a large and dynamic global carbon cycle in which carbon moves in between the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land surface, driven by the biology of organisms. The photosynthetic uptake of CO2 by cyanobacteria and algae in the ocean. Photosynthesis and growth of forests on the land surface, and the accumulation of carbon in trees. So this figure shows CO2 fluxes over time, and the positive values, for example, the gray, shows the rising emissions. Humans have put more and more and more CO2 into the atmosphere. We're burning more and more coal, more and more oil over time. And the values below the zero line, the negative values, reflect where that CO2 ends up. So some of that CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere, in that light blue, the atmospheric fraction. But notice that a substantial amount of carbon ends up on the land surface or in the ocean. So the natural activity of the biological features of our planet are moderating the rate of climate change by sequestering carbon. And the land carbon sink is really dominated by the growth of forests. So here we have another depiction of the same thing, where we have sources of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere on the left and sinks of carbon on the right. So most of the sources of carbon come from the emission of fossil fuels, and there is net deforestation, particularly of deforestation in the tropical forests, that contribute to emissions of carbon as well. But you can see that less than half of that accumulates in the atmosphere, and a lot of that additional CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere is being stored on the land surface. So our forests are already providing a climate benefit to us that is enormously valuable by reducing the rate of climate change. Will this continue into the future? This is another depiction of where that carbon is being stored on the surface of the planet. And so when these fluxes are negative, like the purple bars in, for example, North America, Europe, Asia, and Central America, we have the storage of carbon. Carbon is going out from the atmosphere and being stored in the trees and soils of these systems. But at the same time, we have deforestation, particularly of tropical systems, and emissions of carbon, particularly from tropical systems in South America, Africa, and Asia. So forests store a lot of carbon in the biomass, the woody biomass of tree stems, and in carbon that's stored in the soils of the surface soils in particular. This is moderating climate change. This is a good thing. Will forest carbon sequestration continue or perhaps even increase as CO2 concentrations increase in the atmosphere? Will forests solve our climate problem for us? This is a question we need to know. It has applied implications, but it also relates to our kind of fundamental understanding of how forests work and how forests respond to the atmosphere. This is a classic example of how forest ecosystem science can address a core question about how forests work that has management implications. So there are many ways that we could assess how a biological system responds to elevated CO2. So we can control the CO2 concentration in small little things like growth cabinets where we have a lot of control, but the little seedlings growing in tubes in a growth cabinet is very divorced from the real ecology of actual ecosystems in the field. And so in the 70s and 80s, people started growing and doing these sorts of CO2 experiments in open top chambers with plants planted in the ground, but still in quite manipulated systems. And beginning in the kind of the 90s and continuing to this day, we are manipulating the atmospheric concentrations in intact ecosystems. So this large picture on the bottom shows a loblolly pine forest in North Carolina, where we have changed the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere without like putting a dome over this or dramatically changing this system. If we put a dome over this system, we would be changing water availability and the ability of organisms to move in. We would be changing all sorts of aspects of the ecology of this system in unintended ways. And our goal here is really just to change the CO2 concentration. So I'm going to tell you the story of this experiment and kind of talk you through how we did it and what we found. Again, this is meant to be an example of forest ecosystem science in action. Okay, so the elevated CO2 experiment I am going to describe was done in a loblolly pine forest in North Carolina near Duke University. And so this photo on the left is an aerial photograph of a stand dominated by loblolly pine trees. And each of those circular structures that you see, each of the 7 circular structures was 30 meters in diameter, so 100 feet, big plots, and are exposing the trees in those plots to higher concentrations of carbon dioxide. Some of those plots are simply uninstrumented controls, right? So they're control plots with all the same structural attributes, they just don't emit CO2. And so I'm going to tell you the story of how this works, right? So CO2 is delivered to this site by these enormous trucks, big tanker trucks that are transporting liquefied CO2. It's actually the same CO2 that a big company like Coke or Pepsi buys to carbonate their soda beverages. So this is clean, food-grade CO2. The CO2 would have been emitted to the atmosphere anyway. These come from fertilizer plants where CO2 is produced as a byproduct, and the company just captures that CO2, cleans it, and uses it and sells it to people like Coke or Pepsi or the crazy scientists that want to spend a lot of money buying CO2. And so 2 tankers would arrive at the site every day and deliver liquefied CO2 into these big standing tanks. And it's liquid, so it can be so large quantities can be transported more readily, but that also means it has to be cold to be liquefied. So that pure, liquid, cold CO2 is then passed through these heat exchangers that simply allow the exchange of heat between the atmosphere and the CO2 in the lines. and that warms the CO2 up and turns it into a pressurized gas. I have very fond memories on really hot summer days in North Carolina. You could kind of go stand next to the vaporizer and be hit by these blasts of cold air as the wind would draw the air through the vaporizers, and you do a little outdoor air conditioning. And so we have a line of compressed pure CO2 that's distributed throughout the site to all of the rings and mixed with the atmospheric air in one of these huts, and then a mix of high concentration CO2, but with all the other gases that are normally in the atmosphere, like nitrogen and oxygen and argon, is pumped into this big black pipe. And that big black pipe goes around and surrounds each of the rings and feeds these vertical white pipes that deliver the CO2 into the atmosphere of this system. And the delivery of that concentrated CO2 air into each of these pipes is controlled by these solenoid valves that I'm identifying here to only open some of these big white pipes to deliver CO2 into the system. And then those vertical CO2 delivering white pipes are held up by these support towers, and the gas is coming out of holes that are drilled into these white pipes, distributed through the vertical component of the atmosphere of these plots, such that the forest within this plot is surrounded by these gas pipes. And so then the system is very dynamically controlled by a computer algorithm. So when the wind is coming from the left to the right, the system measures wind speed and direction, and it uses those solenoid valves and opens up the ports on the upwind side, and wind delivers that CO2 enriched air throughout the vertical air column of this forest canopy. If the wind changes direction and comes from the right to the left, the system adjusts and the CO2 is emitted from the right-hand side. So you can see that getting a big, dynamic, complicated system like this together required a collaboration between people like me who are in expertise in kind of the function of trees, with some structural engineers and fluid dynamic modelers and computer scientists. It was a large and collaborative effort. And so here's some examples of the measurements of the CO2 concentration in plots that are not exposed to carbon dioxide, the so-called ambient CO2 plots, and the plots that have the CO2 enrichment through the process that I've just described. And through this free air CO2 enrichment experiment was able to change the atmosphere of this forest dynamically and increase the CO2 concentration in a way that mimics our predictions of climate change without putting a dome or otherwise manipulating the system in unintended ways. So, what did we find? Several decades of research, lots of people's careers, many PhDs, including mine, on this system. We came to kind of this fundamental understanding of this system. So when you expose a forest to increased concentrations of CO2, photosynthesis goes up. CO2 is one of the primary substrates of the photosynthetic reactions, right? So if you increase the concentration of that substrate, the reaction goes faster, and photosynthesis absolutely goes up. And the trees in this system grow faster as well, particularly the pine trees. The stems increase in diameter at a faster rate. These trees are putting on more wood. Carbon did not accumulate in soils. There was more carbon input to soils, more leaf litter, more branches, more root production, but that did not increase soil carbon because decomposition of those inputs increased to match the rate of carbon input. So, in a CO2-rich world, loblolly pine forests, these young, rapidly growing forest plantations, are likely to grow faster and put on more wood in a way that is likely to provide a small benefit to the industrial forest industry. And that might be good news for forest carbon storage at the global scale. However, the amount of extra carbon stored is simply not large enough to make an appreciable difference to our global carbon problem. So if we do a calculation where we assume all the forests in the world are going to store additional carbon in the same way that this loblolly pine forest did, we would have additional sequestration of carbon of about 1.5 gigatons of carbon per year. And that's actually a huge amount of mass. But the problem is it's just a few percent of our emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere. So additional forest growth is not going to solve our climate problem for us. That's the big conclusion of this work. So I would like to finish this section just by reminding you of some core concepts. So forests are fundamentally important to the global carbon cycle. Forests store large amounts of carbon. They are already taking up nearly 1/3 of our emissions, and they are slowing down the pace of climate change. And some forests will grow faster in a CO2-rich world, but this will not solve our climate problem for us. I hope that my presentation has introduced you to the field of forest ecosystem science, and the degree program has exposed you to a couple of examples of what research programs in forest ecosystem science look like, and kind of introduced you to me. And I look forward to getting to know many of you further. I'm sure some of you are my undergraduate advisees. I'll see some of you in a couple of the classes that I teach. And here is my office and email. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks very much.